I thought I'd die alone in that cabin, until a wolf knocked on my door. When I saw the dark stain in the snow, my heart froze because I realized it wasn't carrion, it was someone's destiny. I had risen before dawn to fill my rusted kettle at the creek's edge, as I had for countless winters, expecting nothing more than the usual hush of ice and the distant cry of a jay. My boots crunched hollowly over the frozen ground, each breath a mist that faded into pale morning light. Then, just beyond the drift where footprints of deer led off into shadow, I spotted the stain, so dark against all that white it drew me like a magnet. I bent low at first, thinking perhaps some fox had met its end here, leaving behind a mess of fur and blood to warn scavengers. My old bones ached with every movement, but I could not stop myself. The closer I crept, the more I felt a strange weight settle in my chest, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When I knelt and brushed a glob of ice aside, I saw the shape. No grown beast, but a tiny form curled at the water's edge, fur matted and crusted red, legs splayed at odd angles. My breath caught as I recognized the creature in front of me, a wolf pup, no bigger than a house cat, so small and fragile it looked like hope itself bleeding out on the snow. His chest barely rose and fell. My mind spun with questions I had no right to ask. How had he survived the night? Was his mother out there, somewhere beyond the trees, frantic and starving? I reached toward him, hand trembling, half convinced I would startle him into death. His ribs showed through ragged fur. Each shallow exhale seemed an act of sheer will. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, willing him to fade, to let me slip away and leave this awful burden behind. But then his eyes cracked open. They were two dark pools rimmed with white, the pupils dilated like tiny moons in a frozen sky. He lifted his head unevenly and looked at me. There was fear, yes, raw, primal terror that pulsed through his veins like ice. But beneath it, flickering like the last ember of a dying fire, I saw something stranger, pleading. There was so much pleading in those eyes, I couldn't turn away. It felt as though he was begging me to carry him through the darkness, to bear witness to whatever remained in his shattered life. My heart thundered so loudly I feared he might hear it. I scooped him up, despite every instinct screaming that I should leave him to the wolves. His tiny body was bone and stray muscle, but he weighed more in my arms than any burden I had shouldered in decades. I wrapped him in my coat, surprised at how warm he felt against my chest, and rose slowly, every step away from the creek a struggle. The world seemed to shift around me. The loneliness I had carried since my wife's passing felt suddenly intolerable. Back at the cabin, I laid him on a threadbare blanket before the stove. I knelt, lit the old metal lamp, and watched him with hands calloused by winters and woodcutting. He whimpered once, a sound that tore through my soul. I tore a strip from my own undershirt and bound his hurt leg as best I could. Every knot I tied felt like a promise I was nowhere near ready to keep. I boiled water in the kettle until steam curled like ghostly fingers, then dripped it through a cloth into a small tin bowl. He lapped it with a tongue swelled from thirst, his body shivering so hard I feared the stitches would tear. I sat beside him through the day, ignoring the ache in my joints, listening to the wind lash at the cabin walls. I wanted to believe that when I woke tomorrow, this would all have been a dream, and that the pup would be gone, vanished like a phantom in winter's haze. But when dusk fell and I reached to check his eyes, they opened again, and he looked at me with that same pleading glow. It was then I knew. I thought he would die in my arms. But nature had other plans. I fetched an old bay leaf from the shelf, crushed it between my fingers, and sprinkled it into the water, hoping the old stories held some truth. He drank eagerly, and I felt a flicker of hope. Night settled deep and silent around us. I lay on the floor, my back against the stove, listening to the pup's soft breathing. I told him in a voice rough as gravel, "Rest now, little one. I will not fail you." Somewhere beyond the window, a branch scraped against the glass, and I held my breath, half expecting the forest itself to judge me. But when no second howl answered back, I let out a shaky laugh. Sleep found me at last, but when I woke before the sun, the pup was gone from my side. Panic rose in my throat until I saw him across the room, curled inside the kettle, still alive. I knelt and laid a gentle hand on his head. He blinked up at me as though to say, "Thank you." I closed my eyes, feeling tears slip down my face. I had come to the creek for water, expecting a routine morning. Instead, I had cradled a dying pup and watched life flicker anew. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I could never unsee those eyes or unhear his plea. My solitude was broken, and in its place, something I once thought lost, purpose. When I lifted him into my arms, a pulse of fear shot through me. What had I done, carrying a wild creature into my home? My cabin door creaked shut behind us, sealing out the wind and the indifferent forest beyond. Inside, the stove's feeble warmth did little to thaw the chill in my bones or the tremor in my soul. I laid him gently on the plank floor, his small body barely heavier than a sack of potatoes, but every muscle in my arms ached as if I'd hauled a felled tree. I felt like an intruder, hiding a forbidden thing beneath my roof. By the hearth, I fetched a basin of steaming water and set about cleaning the wound. His fur, matted with ice and blood, peeled away in clumps as I dabbed at it with a rag. He whimpered, a guttural sound so fragile it broke me, and I forced my hand to steady. "Sorry, little one," I whispered, though my voice cracked like old wood. I bound his leg with strips torn from an undershirt, knotting carefully around raw flesh. Each motion felt absurd, like trying to mend the dying heart of the world itself. I glanced at the rifle propped against the wall and felt shame burn in my chest. What right did I have to spare him when every instinct screamed to stay safe, to leave well enough alone? Night plunged the cabin into darkness. I banked the fire to embers, leaving only a dim glow. Sleep fled me as I crouched beside him, every pop and sigh of the wood burning in the stove echoing like footsteps at the door. I couldn't tear my eyes from his small form, curled and shivering on the blanket. My throat felt dry, my heart drumming so loud I was sure he heard it. I tried to imagine the wolf pack roaming free beyond the pines, the call of his mother drifting on the wind, but those thoughts only made me grit my teeth in guilt. I fed him a few spoonfuls of broth. He sniffed warily, then licked it from my palm, his tongue soft and warm, like fire against my cold skin. The contact sent a jolt through me, an electric reminder that this was no mere animal, but a living, breathing soul. With each sip, his shudders lessened. His eyes, once cloudy with pain, brightened, and I dared to hope he might pull through. My breathing grew easier, though the ache in my arms only deepened. Hours dragged by in silence, broken only by his soft whimpers and the slow creak of the cabin settling. I found myself talking to him, mumbling memories I'd long buried, the laughter of my boy when he chased rabbits along the creek, the gentle voice of my wife calling me in from the cold. The words felt foolish on my tongue, but I could not stop. He seemed to listen, head tipped, eyes half closed in trust. Never in all my years had I felt such a stirring in my chest, a flicker of warmth I had thought extinguished with their passing. Around midnight, I dozed in a chair by the stove. I dreamed of the forest turning on me, wolves' eyes glowing in the darkness as they circled my cabin. I jerked awake with a start, sweat chilling on my brow, only to see the pup stirring beside me. His ribs rose and fell in steady rhythm, and he licked my fingers as if to say, "I'm still here." A lump formed in my throat. I stroked his head, marveling at the softness of his fur and felt tears sting my eyes. Have I gone mad? I wondered. Why do I care so deeply for a wild thing that should never have crossed my path? As dawn crept through the frosted window, I gathered enough courage to stand. My back protested, but when I called his name, I had decided to call him Bran, his head lifted, ears perking. He crawled toward me on unsteady legs and pressed his muzzle against my palm. Then, in a moment that cleaved my heart open, he licked my hand, gentle, deliberate. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat. He trusts me, I thought. I can't betray that. Fear and wonder collided inside me. I was a man who had vowed never to let another soul in, yet here I was, careworn and sleepless, utterly devoted to this wild pup. Loneliness and attachment warred in my chest, desperation to protect him tangled with dread of the danger I'd invited. Each time I glanced at him, my resolve faltered. He might live, he might die, and either outcome would break me in ways I could not fathom. As the sun rose higher, I fetched fresh water and wood for the stove. Bran, now steadier on his paws, followed me with bright eyes, tilting his head as though puzzled by the cabin's strange comforts. I watched him explore the small space, sniffing at the worn furniture, and felt something awaken in me. Hope. But even as I considered building a makeshift bed for him by the fire, a voice in my mind whispered, "You're insane. You brought the wild into your home. What happens when he grows?" I knelt and met his gaze, the flickering flames dancing in his pupils. I thought this was merely saving a life, I murmured. But maybe this is the beginning of something far greater. My hands shook as I reached out and laid them on his shoulders. In that instant, I understood that this was more than a rescue. It was a reckoning. And though my mind reeled with uncertainty, my heart had never been clearer. I thought he would be just another burden, but nature had other plans. When I heard those first unsteady footsteps beside the stove, my heart soared because I realized he had decided to live. All night long, I had sat in the rocking chair, dozing with one eye open, listening to the hiss of the fire and the faint rasp of his breath. By dawn, he stirred, head bobbing on wobbly legs, testing the floorboards with shy curiosity. I held my breath as he rose, each step a tiny miracle, until he stood, and I saw in his eyes the spark of survival. I wrapped a threadbare blanket around us both, guiding him to a patch of sunlight that slanted through the frosted window. His paws, still slick with icy slush, slipped and slid, but he kept at it, determined. When he finally plopped onto his haunches and looked up at me, tail wagging in a slow, hopeful rhythm, I laughed aloud, a sound I hadn't made in years. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" I whispered, and he blinked, tongue flicking as if in agreement. I named him Gray, for the swirl of ash in his fur and the quiet resilience I saw shining through his gaze. Gray settled near the stove each night, curling his dirt-speckled body against the warm iron as though it were a cradle. I would wake in the pale morning light to find him pressed against my leg, soft whimpers promising faithfulness. I began to believe he might truly heal. One afternoon, I ventured into the yard to chop wood, Gray trailing behind, staggering over frost-hardened ground. I swung the axe, and as I lifted my foot to step back, I misjudged the uneven plank and tumbled into the snow. Pain bloomed in my shoulder, sharp and sudden, and I lay there, stunned. For a moment, I wondered if I'd ever move again. Then I heard it, a frantic bark, high and urgent. Gray leapt forward, paws digging into the drifts, and disappeared from sight. I called his name, but there was only silence until I saw him emerge, a glove clenched delicately in his jaws. It was my wool mitten, the one I dropped when I fell. He trotted back and placed it at my feet, eyes bright with concern. My breath caught. He had saved me for me. I pressed a hand to my chest, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. "You're not just an animal," I croaked, tears stinging as I rested my palm on his head. "You're something more." He looked at me like I was his own, a bond sealing between us that needed no words. In that moment, the lonely bitterness that had hollowed my days since my family was gone cracked open, letting warmth seep in. Gray nudged my mitten with his nose, then curled beside me as if to say, "I've got you now." I laughed through my tears and hugged him awkwardly, the snow melting cold against my cheek but feeling strangely comforting. Over the next weeks, Gray's strength grew. He chased me around the yard, pouncing on dangling branches and howling at the wind as though greeting an old friend. At dawn, I found him perched on the porch railing, scanning the forest with fierce intensity, and for the first time, I saw not just a pup, but a guardian. I built him a den of straw near the stove, but he preferred to sleep on the hard wood beside me, breathing softly in time with my own rhythm. Yet even as joy bloomed inside me, doubt flickered at the edge of my mind. What would happen when he outgrew these walls? Would he remember me then, or vanish into the wild as though we'd never met? I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the small miracles he performed each day. How he retrieved water from the creek in a battered tin cup, how he flopped onto his back when I scratched behind his ears. One evening, I found him staring into the dying embers of the stove, eyes distant as though listening to some secret song of the forest. I sat beside him silently, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his broad chest. It struck me then how much he had changed me. I had traded solitude for devotion, fear for wonder. I stroked his thickening coat and murmured, "You've brought me back to life, little friend." I thought he would stay with me forever, but nature had other plans. That night, I was jolted awake by a soft scrape at the door. Gray's fur prickled under my hand as he froze beside me, every muscle tensed. My heart pounded in the dark cabin, where the only light came from the dying embers in the stove. I gripped my rifle, certain that any moment now a pack would burst through the door, ravenous and furious. But the noise ceased. A hush fell, broken only by Gray's low growl. I crept to the window and peered through the frost. There, just beyond the porch, stood a wolfess, her coat the color of moonlit ash, her body sleek and powerful. She paused in the pale glow of the lantern I had left burning on the threshold. I expected her to snarl, to charge, to claim her domain. Instead, she stepped inside, silent as snowfall, and settled herself directly across from me. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. The rifle slipped from my trembling fingers, thudding against the wooden floor. I watched in stunned silence as she sat so still, she might have been a statue carved from ice. Gray, eyes narrowed but unafraid, slid forward on his belly. He pressed his nose to the floor, inching closer to his mother. She sniffed at his fur, once, twice, then lifted her head and regarded me. In that moment, she looked at me as though she understood that I had saved her pup's life, that I had given him a second chance few in the wild would have offered. Her amber eyes held no aggression, only calm acknowledgement. My tears sprang unbidden. I sank to my knees, unable to tear my gaze away from hers. I felt as though I was witnessing a miracle, a silent communion between man and beast. I could not move, could not speak. All I could do was watch as she reached a paw forward and gently brushed Gray's muzzle, guiding him back toward the door. He hesitated for a heartbeat, looking back at me with those trusting eyes I had come to love. Then he rose, slipping past the wolfess's silent form, and stepped into the night. The door swung closed behind them with a soft click. I stumbled forward to press my palm against the cold wood, as if I could still feel their warmth. My chest heaved with overwhelming emotion, relief, sorrow, awe, all tangled together. I wept without shame, the tears steaming on my weathered cheeks. For the first time, I understood the fierce loyalty of these creatures, the depth of family bonds that transcended fear and hunger. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and sank back to the floor, staring at the spot where they had vanished into the forest. Minutes passed like hours. I listened to the wind fade, the night returned to its quiet watch. I spoke into the stillness, my voice rough and raw. Safe journeys, my friends. But there was no reply, only the echo of my own words. I stood and crossed to the table, where a single paw print remained pressed into the thin layer of dust. I traced its outline with a trembling finger, marveling at how something so small could leave such an imprint on my heart. My solitude felt shattered and reformed, as though the world had tilted on its axis and shown me a hidden path back to wonder. I moved to tend the stove, piling on logs until the flames danced to life. The cabin glowed with warmth, but I felt cold instead, aching with the absence of those two wolves who had come to my door. I sank into the rocking chair, hands folded over my chest, eyes fixed on the flames. Fear and gratitude warred inside me. I had risked everything to save a wild pup, and in return I received a gift more precious than life itself, proof that the line between man and nature could be drawn in kindness. I pressed my hand to my heart, still trembling. I thought they were saying goodbye. When spring's first thaw cracked the ice on the creek, Gray slipped from my sight as silently as a whisper. I found his empty patch of straw before dawn, the hinges of his makeshift den cold and still. I called his name into the pale morning light, Gray. But the only answer was the ragged cry of a crow overhead. My heart pounded, and I stumbled across the yard, scanning every shadow between the budding birches. He was gone. I spent that day hunting for footprints in the mud, pressing bare palms into the warm earth to trace the outline of his paws, but the rains had washed them away. I returned to the cabin with a hollow in my chest I hadn't known possible. All night, I lay in my bedroll by the stove, head heavy on my folded coat, listening to the wind sigh through the cracks in the walls. Each time I drifted towards sleep, I jolted awake, crying, "Gray," into the dark. Days passed, then weeks, but the cabin remained silent. I went through the motions of my routine, chopping wood at dawn, fetching water, stoking the fire, but each task felt drained of purpose. I found myself pausing at the window, reading the forest's edge like an ancient script, desperate for any sign of him. Yet the trees stood unmoving, indifferent. I began writing again. With a shaky hand, I penned in my old leather notebook the memory of Gray's first breath in my arms, the moment he licked the bruise on my knee after I fell, the deep brown of his gaze when he looked at me as if I were family. The pages filled with my confession of fear and gratitude, a litany of every miracle he had wrought in my life. Writing soothed me, stitch by stitch, until words replaced the silence that threatened to swallow me. I baked bread for the first time in years, kneading the dough on the table my wife and I had carved our initials into decades ago. The scent of yeast and warm flour drifted through the cabin like a benediction. I pulled the golden loaf from the oven, crust crackling, and placed it on a plate. Each slice I tore off felt like an offering, each bite a taste of hope I was determined to believe in. Still, when the evening shadows lengthened, I found myself whispering into the hush, "He will return." My voice wavered, but the words gave me comfort, as though the forest itself might carry them to wherever Gray roamed. I never spoke them aloud to another soul. There was no one to hear, but in the quiet of my cabin, those words were as solid as the chimney's stones. A month became a season, and a season became a year. The sap flowed in the maples, then dried back into bark. The flowers bloomed, withered, and bloomed again. Through it all, I tended the land and tended my heart, keeping vigil in the only way I knew how. My journal swelled with entries, sketches of paw prints, fragments of dreams filled with his silhouette, prayers murmured to the moon. On the anniversary of his departure, I stood at the creek's edge at dawn, the same spot where I had first found him. I knelt and ran my fingers through the cold water, stirring the reflection of pale sky. I closed my eyes and held my breath, waiting for the crackle of paws on ice, the soft rustle of fur. Nothing came but my own echo in the glassy stream. I walked back to the cabin and stoked the fire, flames licking the iron stovepipe, and placed a fresh journal beside the kettle. I poured a cup of tea and sat in the rocking chair, rocking gently, my hands wrapped around the warm tin mug. I stared at the empty straw den in the corner, tracing its contours with my gaze as though mapping a missing piece of my soul. Then, in the quiet between heartbeats, I felt a stirring inside me, not grief nor joy, but something soft and sure. I realized I had changed. My back was straighter, my breath deeper, my spirit lighter. The grief I had carried was no longer a weight, but a current guiding me onward. I understood at last that Gray's absence had not broken me. It had freed me to remember the kindness that still flowed in the world. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dusk, "He will return." The words floated upward like a prayer, untethered yet alive. I did not know if he ever would, but for the first time, I believed that my life, our life, was larger than any single moment. The forest waited beyond the door, patient as ever, secrets buried in the thawing earth. 3 years passed, and I nearly forgot. When the first crack of frozen timber broke the midnight silence, my heart seized because I knew wolves had come. The wind howled beyond the walls of my cabin, and the stove's embers had long since died to a weak glow. I lay awake on my cot, senses straining for each sound. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps on the snow-slick porch. My breath caught in my throat, an old fear twisted in my gut. Gripping my rifle, I rose on unsteady legs, every joint protesting. I crept to the door, hand shaking so fiercely I could scarcely turn the latch. I thought of pack howls and flashing teeth, of talons ripping at flesh. I unhooked the bolt and flung the door open, my shotgun rising in trembling arms. The moonlight spilled across the clearing, cold and unforgiving. I aimed and held my breath. There, framed in silver light, stood a wolf enormous as a bear. His coat was thick and dark, fur shimmering with frost. His eyes, amber orbs deeper than any I had seen, fixed on mine. Beneath him stood 2 smaller forms, shapes I recognized as pups, their fur damp with snow. My finger hovered on the trigger, but my chest constricted. My heart thundered in my ears, drowning out every instinct that urged me to shoot. He did not snarl. He did not bare his fangs. He simply stood and looked at me, as if waiting. Waiting for what? I could not say. The pups pressed close to his legs, shivering but silent, eyes bright with curiosity. I felt tears sting my eyes, and my hands grew too heavy to hold the gun. I let it fall, dusting snow from the barrel, and sank to my knees on the porch's icy plank. He came, not as a beast, as a son, I murmured, voice thick with wonder. I had expected fear, but I was overwhelmed by something far more powerful: recognition. The wolf's gaze was not wild. It was familial. It was gratitude. One pup ventured forward, head lowering in a silent greeting. The larger wolf lowered himself slowly, nose brushing the smaller's back before lifting his head to me again. He cocked his head, and I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. The cold air burned my lungs, but I hardly noticed. My tears fell freely, steaming before they hit the snow. I stretched a hand toward him, palm open like a peace offering. He sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, and then advanced. When his muzzle brushed my fingers, warmth flooded through me. My tears turned to quiet sobs. I pressed my cheek to his fur, rough, thick, alive, and felt his pulse beneath my ear. Behind us, the pups circled, tails wagging in slow arcs. They sniffed at my boots, then nuzzled my knees. I laughed brokenly, the sound echoing into the silent forest. My loneliness shattered into a million shards, each one reflecting the bond we shared. The great wolf stepped back, casting a glance at me that felt like a benediction. He dipped his head, then turned and padded toward the trees, the pups trotting at his heels. I pressed a hand to my heart, unwilling to let go of the moment. I thought I would call after them, but no words came, only breath, white and fragile in the freezing air. They melted into the pines as silently as they had appeared. The moonlight shifted, and I was alone again on the porch, shotgun at my feet and soul laid bare. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the bottom step, staring at the spot where they had vanished. My tears froze on my beard, and I laughed in disbelief. I thought it was our final meeting, I whispered to the dark, my voice lost in the night. But I did not believe it. Deep inside, I felt a certainty that this was not the end. The forest, once a realm of dread, had become a place of hope. The wolves had shown me that family could transcend walls and seasons, that gratitude could bridge the divide between species. I rose at last, brushing snow from my coat, and closed the cabin door behind me. Inside, I relit the stove, its warmth seeping into my bones. I hung my rifle by the mantel, knowing I would never need it for fear again. As the flames danced, I pressed my hand to my chest, where my heartbeat had once been lonely, now thrummed with a fierce joy. I sat at the table, journal open before me, and wrote those words with a steady hand. He came not as a beast, but as a son. Then I paused, listening to the wind's soft answers beyond the logs. I knew my world had forever changed, and though I did not yet know when they would return, I was certain of one thing: I would be waiting. When dawn's pale light crept over the thawing fields, I heard a soft rustle at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped, for I knew that sound. I rose from the porch, hands trembling, and there he was again, alone, majestic, the ash-gray wolf I had come to call family. He sat on the frozen earth, watching me with those piercing amber eyes that held both wildness and something like gratitude. I fetched a hunk of stale bread and a chunk of salted venison from my larder, carrying them out on a small wooden tray. My breath came in warm puffs that vanished in the cool morning air. He did not move, did not growl or prowl. He simply sat, calm as the still waters of the creek in winter. I placed the food a short distance before him, every step feeling as sacred as a pilgrimage. We did not speak. There was no need for words. Day after day, I had tended my loneliness like a stubborn wound. Yet, here, standing before this creature, I felt the scar begin to heal. He sniffed the offerings, and I watched the rise and fall of his flanks as he devoured them, powerful and silent. Then he lifted his head and looked at me again. In that gaze, I felt something resonate deep within my chest, something I had never known I was missing. The ache of years spent in solitude softened, replaced by a warmth I thought lost forever. I knelt on the porch step, hands resting on my knees, and spoke in a voice that trembled with wonder. You gave me something I didn't know I was searching for. The wolf's ears twitched, and he inclined his head once, as if acknowledging the truth of my words. I smiled through tears, feeling the world shift beneath my feet. For a timeless moment, we remained like that, two souls united by a bond neither of us could fully explain. Then, with a graceful turn, he rose and padded back toward the forest, blending into the budding green as though he had never been. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted into wet earth and fledgling leaves unfurled on the birch trees, but the wolf did not return. I watched the horizon each morning, scanning the tree line for that ash-gray silhouette, but the forest remained still. I carried my morning tray to the same spot on the porch, set it down, and waited, though no footsteps ever answered my call. At night, I sat by the dying embers of the stove, replaying that spring morning in my mind. His eyes, so full of knowing, his quiet grace, his parting as if to say, "Remember." I found myself rising before dawn, trudging to the porch in solitude, peering into the half-light for any sign of him. My hopes flickered, like the lamp's flame, alive and fragile. I cleared the cabin's floorboards of last winter's dust. I polished the kettle until it gleamed. I planted seeds in a small patch of earth beyond the porch, hoping the wolf might pause there too one day. Each task I performed with care, as though preparing an altar for his return. But the days slipped by, and no shadow crossed the threshold. Sometimes a distant howl would drift on the breeze, and I would start at the sound, certain it was him calling back to me. My heart would race, only to slow with disappointment when the echo faded into the forest's hush. Still, I kept waiting. My solitude had been transformed by that single visit, no longer a prison, but a reminder that gratitude and wonder can arrive unannounced. I found solace in small routines, writing in my journal of that morning's confession, baking a fresh loaf each week, setting a bowl of water on the porch in case he grew thirsty. The world around me blossomed into life, wildflowers along the creek, birds at the feeder I built from scrap lumber. I existed in a quiet communion with nature, unburdened by fear. And then, one golden evening, as the sun dipped low and the woods glowed with spring's light, I realized with a pang that I thought it was over. No more visits, no more silent communion. I had woven our meeting into the fabric of my days so completely that his absence now felt permanent. I paused on the porch, hand poised over the door latch, heart heavy with longing, and in that instant, I thought, I believed this was the end. When the blizzard raged outside, I lay in my creaking bed, chest tight with each breath. My bones throbbed with age and illness, and I feared I might never feel warmth again. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters and flinging drifts of snow against the walls. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, though I did not trust these final hours. Then there came a knock, a soft, deliberate rap at the door, like a paw tapping glass. My heart jolted, each beat echoing in my ears. I struggled upright, every joint protesting, and reached for my cane. With trembling hands, I hobbled through the dim cabin, guided by the weak glow of the oil lamp. Each step was agony, but something in that knock, so gentle, so persistent, drove me forward. I grasped the latch and pulled. A blast of icy wind rushed in, carrying a swirl of snowflakes that stung my face. And there he stood, the ash-gray wolf, massive and regal, his fur crusted with frost. His amber eyes glowed with a familiar intelligence. My breath caught so sharply I thought my ribs might crack. My legs gave way beneath me, and I sank to my knees on the snow-packed threshold. Pain lanced through my body, but I could not look away. The wolf stepped forward, head low, nostrils flaring. He paused within a whisper's distance and lifted one great paw, treading carefully so as not to startle me further. Tears blurred my sight. I reached out with a trembling hand, gnarled with years and illness, and hesitated. My heart thundered. Was this real? Was I dreaming? Then the wolf lowered his massive muzzle and touched his cold, wet nose to my palm. In that electrifying instant, I knew I was not alone. I felt the pulse of his life against my own, a silent promise that compassion endures. The wind fell hushed, as though the storm itself paused to bear witness. Snowflakes drifted around us, but we stood still, two souls united across the chasm of species and time. He raised his head and looked at me as though bidding farewell. There was no menace in his eyes, only gratitude, loyalty, and something like love. Then, with a single graceful turn, he melted into the swirling white, leaving only his footprints behind. I remained on the doorstep, kneeling in the snow, chest heaving. My tears froze on my beard, and I did not mind. My heart felt lighter than it had in decades. I knew I had witnessed something impossible. This could not have happened. I whispered into the empty air. I should not have seen it. But I have. Nature is wiser than we think. It remembers kindness. I stumbled back inside and closed the door. The wolf's presence lingered like a warm ember in my soul. I sank to the floor and pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart still beating. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside me, there was a calm I once believed lost forever. If your heart is still racing, then you understand. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the truth about animals and life. If your heart is now full of awe, right, nature is wiser than us.